Alright, so the next thing we're going to take a look at is going to be copying objects. So whenever we want to copy an object in our program, this is going to be very similar to we want to make a copy of an array. Performing a direct copy or a direct assignment will only copy the reference and not the object itself. So you can see that in this line of code, or really these two lines of code that we have right here. So we've got a stock object called company1. This is going to be equal to a new stock object with the string for its the name that's going to be associated with it, or its symbol price. In this case, we're just going to call it XYZ, which is some made-up stock name. And then the other thing is going to be the share price. In this case, it's going to be that double 9.62. So we're just trying to construct a new stock object with these two different fields. And then in the next line, we're going to create another, in this case, another reference variable, company2, also going to have the same class type of stock. And we're going to just directly assign to company2 company1. And what this is going to do is company1 and company2 are now going to both reference the same object. So this particular idea, what we refer to as a reference copy, is also going to be known as a shallow copy. So in this sense, it's a very shallow kind of surface level copy, where the only thing that we've done is just copied the reference and not the object itself. So if we use the box and key analogy for how we go about describing the relationship between our reference variables and the objects that they reference, a shallow copy essentially makes a copy of the key rather than a copy of the locked box. In most cases, a duplicate key would be considered a security risk. So in most cases, if you're thinking about, you have this one locked box and you have one key that goes to that box, if you make a duplicate key out of it, if anybody else were to get a hold of that duplicate key, which admittedly in a lot of contexts is very easy, then you run into a security risk. Now somebody else can get into or access that locked box. So ideally, we don't really want to do it this way. I already showed an example before when we talked a little bit about using objects with methods. If we pass an object, the reference variable, into a method through the parameters of that method, we saw that that would cause some problems with the original reference where modifying the fields is observed by both. So we've already seen a little bit about this security risk, about the problems that arise from it. So the thing that we want to go ahead and do instead is construct a new object using the fields of the object that we intend to copy. In this particular case, we'll make a copy of the object itself. This is going to be known as a deep copy. So whereas this reference copy is known as a shallow copy, when you make a copy of the object itself, that is going to be known as a deep copy. So in this particular instance, we've created our first stock object, so that first line of code still looks exactly the same. The key difference is that now, when we move over to company 2, we're going to create a whole nother new stock object. So we use the new keyword, and we call the constructor again, and then we're going to go ahead and pass in the two different fields of company 1. So we're going to give it the symbol, and we're going to give it the share price. So in this case, we now have two distinct locked boxes, and each of those locked boxes will have its own unique key. So in this case, we're going to remove any potential security risk. So let's go ahead and minimize this. Let's come over to NetBeans. So we'll take a look at the rectangle demo so we can see this. So if we want to go ahead and make a copy of one of these, let's say that right now we've got our get rectangle with the values 15 and 5. That goes into this rect variable. And then our box, we want to do the same thing with that so that then later, when we check to see if they're equal, that's still going to be true. So let's say that instead of trying to construct another separate object by just specifying the values 15 and 5, I instead want to indicate that this is copying the values from rectangle, so the box is essentially a copy of that. So instead of putting 15 and 5 right here, I'm going to remove this value, and I'm going to say that I want to get the length of rectangle, or of a rect of this variable right here. So I want to put that into this parameter, or this argument for it. So we're going to use the getLength method. Go ahead and grab that. And then right here, we're going to say rect.getWidth. So we want to go ahead and just essentially make a copy out of the previous one by getting the exact same fields or the exact same values for those fields. So if we go ahead and run this, we can see that the rectangles are equal. That line right there at the very end is still going to appear. And then if we change the values for rect, so we make this something like 20 and 8, let's say, go ahead and save that, and run this again, we'll see that the rectangles are still going to be equal to each other. So if we take another look at this distinction between a shallow copy and a deep copy to kind of give you a more visual explanation of exactly the distinction. So when we think of our shallow copy, we have our original reference, so that's one of the reference variables, and we have our new reference, so the other reference variable, and we see that they both point to or they both reference the same original object. We never made a copy of the object, so the only thing we have is the original. Alternatively, with a deep copy, we have two completely separate instances. So we've got our original reference that points to or references the original object, and we have our new reference which points to or references the new object. So in this case, we can now see that we've got our two separate locked boxes, and each one has its own reference, which means that each one has its own unique key. So to simplify the process of copying objects, we can go ahead and create a copy method inside of our class. We'll take notice of the fact that in the body of the copy method, a new object is constructed, and then a reference to that newly constructed object is returned from the method. And as I mentioned before, whenever it comes to returning a reference to something from a method, we are not particularly concerned with any security risks, because after that happens, that method is essentially removed or kind of destroyed. So any references that were inside of it just become irrelevant. So there's no concern about having two separate references. One of those is basically taken away, and we only keep the one, in this particular case, on line, the second line at the very bottom here where we have stock company 2. Company 2 will be the only reference variable that we have left after that method is done. So in this particular case, we're going to say company 2 is going to be equal to company1.copy. So we're going to call the copy method on company 1. That then goes into this method that we have right here. So we can go ahead and create a copy of that object by getting the symbol and share price. And we're going to make use out of the this keyword so that we can very clearly tell what it is that we are intending to do here. And then we're just going to go ahead and return that copy that we just created. So let's go ahead and do this as well. So we'll come back over here. So let's go to the bottom. Close this for now. Go to the bottom of our rectangle. And right here, we're going to go ahead and create our copy method. So the key thing to keep in mind about this copy method, so just like all of our methods, it's going to be public. For the return type of the copy method, because of the fact that we need to go ahead and return the object that we just created a copy of, that object should naturally match the data type of the class that we're inside of. So we're going to go ahead and specify, because this is dealing with rectangles, we want to make a copy of a rectangle object. We want to return it, so we're going to say public rectangle. And we'll go ahead and do copy. And inside of here, we're going to go ahead and, okay, for this one, we're going to go ahead and specify nothing. So this one will have no arguments. In a moment, we'll see another variation on this that does. But for this particular one, we're going to go ahead and do this. We'll go ahead and create or construct that rectangle object. So we'll call this something like rect copy. This will be equal to a new rectangle object. Inside of here, because I'm dealing with a length and a width field, I want to go ahead and put those two things into this constructor. So we're going to say this.length and this.width. So at this point now, I essentially have a copy of the object, putting that into rect copy, and then I'm just going to go ahead and return it. Okay. So then, if I come back over to rectangle demo, instead of doing all of this, what I can go ahead and do is just say that I want to use this rect. We'll use this reference variable right here, and we're going to go ahead and make a copy of the object that it references. So I'm going to replace this line of code with rect.copy. Okay. So now that'll go ahead and do the same thing that it was doing before. Instead, though, it's going to go ahead and call this copy method, and then all of that functionality is going to be handled right here. where it will go ahead and just create the copy and return it for us. So then if you go ahead and run this program, you'll see that these two things are still going to be equal to each other. So at the very end here, we can see the rectangles are equal, and it's still going to be true. So then if we want to go ahead and try to simplify this even further, so there's another variation on the copy method, which is known as the Copy Constructor. So this is going to be yet another type of constructor that we can work with. This will allow a copy of an object to be immediately constructed by simply passing in a reference to that object. So in this particular case, we're doing it with the stock class here, still here. So we have our public stock indicating this is going to be the constructor method, and then the thing that we pass into this copy constructor is going to be the other object that we want to make a copy of. So we're going to say stock copied stock, and then inside the body of this copy constructor, what we're going to go ahead and do is just get the two fields. So we're going to indicate the fields of the object that we're currently in. Those are going to be with this dot symbol and this dot share price, and then we're going to say that these are equal to, and then we're going to get the symbol and share price of the object that we're actually making a copy of. So that's going to be copied stock dot symbol and then copied stock dot share price. So then if we take a look at the two lines underneath that, on the first line, again, we're still creating that stock company 1 with the string XYZ, share price 9.62. In the next line, we're going to go ahead and use the new keyword, and we're going to call the constructor for stock. But in this particular case, we're passing in company 1, which is going to be a reference variable to an object of the stock class. So that means we're going to be using this copy constructor. So if we want to kind of reimagine replacing things like this or copied stock to fit the context of what we're doing right here, essentially what we're saying in those two lines is that we have company 2 dot symbol is going to be equal to company 1 dot symbol, and then company 2 dot share price is going to be equal to company 1 dot share price. So essentially we're just taking the values that are in each of those fields of company 1 and we're copying those over into the fields of company 2. So let's go ahead and minimize this. We'll once again come back over to NetBeans. We'll go back over to our rectangle. And so now, in addition to this copy method we made right here, let's go make a copy constructor as well. And close that again. So we'll come up to the top here. And let's say, right after creating this additional constructor right here, underneath this, we'll go ahead and put in our copy constructor. So we're going to say public rectangle, and then the thing that we need to pass in, because we're dealing with rectangles, so if we want to make a copy here, it's going to have to be of type rectangle. So we're going to say rectangle, let's call it other rect. So you can do other rect, you could maybe call it copied rect. There's a couple of different names you could use for that. And then inside of here, we want to go ahead and specify which field corresponds to what. So if we're dealing with the fields of the object who is going to be the copy, so that's the one that we're currently trying to construct, we're going to use the this keyword. So we'll say this dot length is going to be equal to this other rectangle. So we're going to do other rect dot length, and then this dot width is going to be equal to other rect dot width. Okay, so if we go ahead and save this, so now what we could go ahead and do, we'll come over to our rectangle demo. Another way that we could do this now is, instead of doing or calling the copy method on a rect object, we could go ahead and say that we want to make a new rectangle, and then we're going to go ahead and just pass this rect reference variable into that. So we're just going to go ahead and take this. That's going to be used right here as our parameter for this copy constructor. So then if we take a look at the body of this, we could essentially imagine this, anytime we see the word this, you can think of that as your box, and anywhere where you see other rect, you can think of that as your rect. So essentially what we're saying is we're going to do box.length is equal to rect.length, and then box.width is equal to rect.width. So essentially we're just taking the length and width, those two fields of our rect object, and we're copying those over into the length and width fields of our box object. And then of course there's another way that we could go ahead and do this that would make it a little bit more compact. So this is actually going to be a pretty convenient case for using this keyword to indicate that we want to call another constructor method in our class. So we're trying to get the length and width from this object that we have right here, which is not terribly different from getting the length and width if we're just providing those as two separate doubles. So we see that the structure right here is very similar to the structure right here. So what we could go ahead and do is just call this method right here. So what we can do is we can change all of this. So we're going to go ahead and call the other constructor using this, and what we can pass in is just going to be otherRect.length and otherRect.width. So this way we can go ahead and just reduce that down to a single line of code. If you're dealing with an even larger class where the objects have significantly more fields than just these two, then naturally doing it this way would be even more efficient. But the general idea here is that this is a pretty good use case to go ahead and just use this keyword to reference another one of these constructor methods. So in this case now what we're going to do is we first come into this one. When we first make the call to the constructor right here, because we passed in a rectangle, that's going to come to this particular constructor method. So otherRect is going to be equal to or have assigned to it that rect that we're passing in. We'll then go ahead and get the length and width from that rect object. We're going to go ahead and call the other constructor, the parameterized constructor up here. And from here, we're going to go ahead and take that length and width and assign those to the appropriate fields. So the length and width fields of, in this case, box. Okay. And so of course then if we run this again with that slight variation, naturally the output is expected to be exactly the same, which is that again the rectangles are still going to be equal to each other. Okay, so at this point this will wrap up everything for being able to copy objects. So we saw two different variations on this, one where we just created the copy method and then another where we created a copy constructor. So now that we've seen this, we will take what we've learned from this section and apply this to the next one, which is going to be on aggregation, where now we're going to talk a little bit about creating fields in a class in which the data type of those fields is another custom class. So we're going to take a look at aggregation in the next video.